The ledger of names by the time Julia Diaz signed herself in for the late shift. The rain had laid itself over the city like a damp cloth. St. Augustine. Hospital smelled of lemon disinfectant and something older ink and dust, the faint iron of memory. She had driven straight from her brother's apartment after his voice on the phone had made the drive itself feel foolish. A woman trapped somewhere between clarity and panic calling for the one person who could cross circuits and find calm. Martin lay in ICU in a private room, too wired to sleep. The fourth line hissed low. The monitors read numbers that made no promises. He'd been admitted 2 nights earlier for an adverse reaction, but what panicked him now was not the calculus of labs. It was sound, he told her, breathless, there in the walls. They call names. His fingers trembled when they curled around hers. You mean the pipes? She asked, because that was the reasonable map. They don't want pipes, he said. They want names. The word was small and horrible. In the quiet after she'd told him the department could consult a neurologist, he said, they sealed the south wing years ago, after the fever. Pipes go through there now. It started with the maintenance men, Luis, Carter, O'Neill. They went to fix a leak and didn't come back. Security footage stops, the door snaps shut. Then the ledger, he fished for formality, as if anchoring to paperwork would keep the world sensible. Hargreaves has a ledger. At the nurse's desk, Hargreaves watched her with a man who has seen things softness. He slid a manila envelope across the counter without preamble. Inside was a ragged ledger whose pages had been turned until the edges sighed. Columns of names, admissions, transfers, discharges. Some names were crossed out with ink that had bled into the paper like old wounds. Marginalia in smaller hand. Could not be located. Family notified no next of kin. Missing after maintenance. Later, in a shaky script, sound beneath tiles registered. Patients report names called. Maintenance sealed south wing. Pipework rerouted. No further action claimed by board. MB. Hargreaves said the initials as if saying them would not unspool what had been tied. Mary Braddock, Julia asked, old head nurse. Retired 2 weeks after that note. Hargreaves' voice was a dry leaf. Board cleaned things up. They sealed the wing. They recycled security footage after a week. If anything is missing in the official files, someone found it convenient. The ledger named Luis Ramos in a maintenance report, his signature certain at the bottom. A penciled note in the margin had been crossed out. Water sounds like them. It asks. The thought sat in her like a stone. Pipes had a presence in St. Augustine the way old people had presence. They held histories you could neither look at nor touch without awakening something. At night they whispered, the building's bones tuning themselves to the city, and those whispers could be made sensible by lonely, grieving ears. There was always a humane skepticism in nurses, the functional disbelief that kept them from being prey to rumor. But when Julia walked the corridor toward the sealed south wing later that night, something caught at her, a memory of being a child called in the dark, of names turned into directions. Dr. Lillian Park, the administrative director, was all cool competency. She told Julia the wing had been sealed after an outbreak years ago, that containment protocols had been followed, and that the board preferred to remember St. Augustine as a sanctuary rather than a building with an unfortunate plumbing history. She authorized limited archives access for the morning, but forbade anyone to enter the sealed wing. Restricted, she said, as if that should be enough. There are ways to obey, and there are ways to listen. Julia listened. A nurse had quit on the third night, pale and hollow-eyed, saying she'd heard her son's name called from behind the tiles. Another staffer had wandered into the chapel and knelt, and stayed until the chaplain carried him out. A list had appeared near the sealed door, names in hurried pencil, each with a small check or a cross and dates March 9th, July 14th, like constellations of absence. At the bottom, written as if someone had been telling themselves a command, "Do not answer." The south wing door was not locked. A key lay on the floor as if recently dropped. Beyond, the ramp descended into a staleness that smelled of damp tile and old decisions. Aaron, an intern with a flashlight and the raw face of someone who had not yet learned which rules break you, met her at the threshold. His badge had no clip. He had heard names in the vents the night before, and his laugh when he told her had been too quick to be genuine. They moved down together. The pipes above them made a soft language of clinks and long notes. At first the sound was just plumbing, but then some pattern emerged, a susurration like consonants trying to become a proper word. The tiles themselves seemed to breathe. In the beam of Aaron's flashlight, impressions on the floor darkened as if being traced little handprints and boot soles, the negative shapes of people gone. At the far end, a door had been nailed shut hastily. The nails were rusted but not ancient. Someone had been here recently. They hammered them free with a borrowed tool, and the hinges sighed. Inside was a single bed and a basin and a damp outline on the floor where a body had once rested. On the wall, with a charred finger, someone had written, "We took what they said." When they stepped in, the lights in the corridor behind them went out. The hospital held its breath. The pipes settled into a low, expectant tone. Then the voice, soft and patient as a hand on a shoulder, said, "Julia Diaz, do you have a name for me?" It was not a voice as much as a shaping of sound that made a name like a small animal. The names being in the room pulled at something like obligation. Julia's first instinctive answer was to leave, to run up through the stairwell and out into rain that at least made sense when it fell. But in her hands, the ledger Hargreaves had left with her felt warm from being handled. The pages had names of people who had not been found. She thought of Martin's fingers and Mrs. Ortega, an old patient in room 12 whose skin had been paper thin and whose smile had not met her eyes. "Do you have a name?" The woman had asked when Julia had visited. They only take those who will not say their name. Names, Julia had learned as a child, were how people found their place in the world. Her name was how her mother called her from the sidewalk. Their hunger for names felt like a perverse homemaking. Something in the hospital had been turning the most intimate human thing into currency. They found the chalk list at the mouth of the corridor, names pinned with a syringe cap and a safety pin. Among the checked ones were people who'd been called into work and never returned. The maintenance report listed the 3 men, List, Carter, O'Neill. The ledger recorded Mary Braddock's terse note and then a blank, as if a pen had given up. Someone had tried to annotate the ledger's margins with a pencil. It asks. The pencil line had been crossed out. Aaron wanted to run. He wanted a security guard and a camera and 30 degrees of rational corroboration. Julia wanted to hold the ledger up to the light and read the cross lines as if they were palimpsests. They were interrupted by a sound like a small, wet laugh that came not from a throat, but from the tiles. The water in the drain churned. A dry hand had traced the damp outline on the floor, and the trace darkened as if the air itself had been given texture by wanting. The hospital's script was old. Seal the dangerous places, sweep the margins, sign the ledger, and pretend the world was square. But if you pay attention to the margins, sometimes the ledger writes back. Julia began to see the mechanism in a way a clinician learns to see sepsis in a lab value. The pipes called names. Names have a shape. Names could be answered. Where a name was answered spoken back, the sound might slide down into the walls and open a place in a person the thing could occupy. You became a point of habitation, waiting rooms for whatever listened. They take the shapes people leave behind, Martin had said in the night before his bed went cold. The sounds that tell people apart. They want signatures, not bodies. If they call you and you answer, something clicks. His eyes had been glass pinpricks. He had tried to teach her the ledger's grief. They asked for names. People answered. In a small room off the corridor, they found the bones of a confession, a maintenance log with a note, hands smudged around it, a small child's shoe pressed into tile, a scrap of hospital linen embroidered with a name that had been crossed out. There was a ritual in the way things were left behind: toys, notes, and always names. The pipes sang as if the hospital itself was tuning strings. They tried to break whatever bargain had been made. They tried to pour cold water down drains and wedge doors. They contacted Dr. Park over the intercom. She was practical and thinly tired, offering to open the archives in the morning and advising them to evacuate the wing. "We don't have procedures for whatever you're describing," she said. "Keep staff safe." But safety had a cost. People were vanishing from rooms. A security guard who had gone to fetch a cart, a nurse who'd left a cup of tea to cool and never tasted it again. The ledger's crossed names multiplied. Hargreaves whispered of payroll removals and hushed calls from wives and then silence. When they returned to ICU to get a respirator filter, whatever plans looked like in the dark Martin's bed was empty. Monitors still blinked with a polite, untroubled beep. The linens had been folded back. His chart lay open and the 4-line dangled. Aaron found a shoe by the door. A wet trail led toward the corridor to the south wing like a tide. The hospital's heart monitors kept time as if nothing were wrong. Sound mattered more than evidence when evidence could be manufactured. There were eyes to be kept calm. Julia's hands shook. People's stabilities are fragile and contagious. She could have called security. She could have done any number of sensible administrative things. Instead, she went back into the sealed wing alone. At the boarded room, the place with the nail-riven door that read, "We took what they said," she took the ledger. The pages smelled like dust and the small, dry phenomenon of other people's grief. She read names aloud into the room like a litany at first. A clinical experiment. Luis Ramos, Carter Mills, O'Neill Ford. The tiles drank them as if they were only syllables. The voice came back, softer now, like someone learning to imitate the ledger's cadence. Luis Ramos, it returned, and the name returned like an echo that had learned to be a thing. The sound shifted the air. Julia felt, irrationally, that there was some accounting being reconciled, columns balancing across the room. When the pipes asked for her name, it came as a conspiratorial suggestion rather than a demand. She thought of Mary Braddock's note, no further action claimed by board, and of the maintenance men who had been called in the night and not called out. She thought of Martin's fingers, the patient in room 12, and the nurse who had fled, her hands cupped around a week-old grief. The ledger at her belly felt like proof and like temptation. You are taught to be precise with names. To say a patient's full name before administering narcotics is to keep track. To withhold a name was an act of forgetting. She could give it to them. She could speak her name into the tiles and satisfy whatever appetite had been feeding on the edges of the staff roster. Or she could refuse and watch the ledger swell with other signatures as people vanish like committees making decisions without consulting the people affected. "You can't save everyone," Aaron said in the way people tell each other this in the immediately hopeless hour. He had been crying. He was young enough to still believe in right answers. "You can save one," Julia said, "or die trying." She unhooked the ledger, smoothed the open page to the damp tile, and wrote, because writing feels like ownership, the names of the maintenance men, the nurse, the patients whose faces she had known. The pen scratched like a small machine. The ink looked too black. When she reached the end of the line, she wrote her own name as if completing a list of inventory. Diaz, Julia. Her hand did not tremble. The pipes took the name like a tide taking a shell. The return voice was hers, or it sounded like her, but thinner, filtered through tile, as if a microphone had been placed in the mouth of language itself. It said in her voice, "Do you have a name for me?" And because language is a circle, because answering is what made the doors open, she said, "Yes." What followed was neither a shattering scream nor a miracle. It was a settling. The drain's water churned, and the impression on the tile, the outline of a person filled with shadow. The ledger's ink feathered as if wet. Upstairs, monitors went quiet in rooms that had been noisy with the breathing of living things. Down the hall, a nurse who had been planning to quit sat down and sobbed, clutching her badge to her chest. Names that had been crossed out found a new column. When the morning came, Dr. Park's office smelled of coffee and clinical exasperation. The board demanded answers, and the police demanded statements. The ledger was returned to Hargreaves with a note in a careful corporate hand about chain of custody. Hargreaves folded it and put it under his desk as if hiding it in plain sight. Martin's bed in ICU remained made. The shoe at the corridor's mouth was gone. Aaron left and never came back to the hospital. He called from a halfway house months later and thanked her for not letting him be the one. Taken. Mrs. Ortega's chart had a neat annotation. Discharged against medical advice. Her file had no record of anything supernatural. Records, the hospital taught, are the places you keep your reality. In the weeks after, the pipes sang less often. Staff attendants studied. The board closed its eyes and tightened its smile. But sometimes, in the night when the building settled, a nurse would pass the sealed door and hear a name called back in a voice that sounded much like their own. The ledger in Hargreaves' desk had a fresh page that had not been there before. Someone had written a steady hand, small and sure, Diaz, Julia. On her last shift before she resigned and moved away from the hospital, Julia stood in the corridor outside the sealed wing for a long time and listened. There was the soft, bureaucratic beep of the monitors and the hush of footsteps. When she walked past room 12, the old woman met her eyes and smiled in a way that might have been gratitude or relief. In the end, Julia did not vanish in the way the ledger had feared. She did not leave a body pressed into tile or a shoeless trail. She left something else, a voice that would be used now and again like a tool to call names into order. Staff said the calls were softer, less hungry. Sometimes they called to locate a missing infant, sometimes to comfort a restless patient. The pipes still asked. The ledger still took. Martin's file was closed with the fate line, transferred unknown. There are places in hospitals for things you cannot explain. People made peace with phrases like transferred, removed, unlocated. They are useful phrases that stop the asking. But the pipes remember how to call. They remember every syllable, and sometimes, when the building is quiet and the rain comes back, you can hear a name spoken in the voice of someone who used to be human and who once, in the most human way, tried to give what she could for the sake of the people she cared for. On a late night, when the rain tapped out a slow rhythm, the south wing will breathe, and a voice will say, softly and familiarly, "Do you have a name for me?" And sometimes, if you are alone and stubborn and willing to listen, you will answer, and the hospital will keep its bargains one fewer broken at a time.
To support this channel, please like this video and subscribe the channel.